うん。
So, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. Um, so what we're going to do today is talk about the last of our sessions. And what we've been doing, of course, is looking at the five tenets of Jodo Shinshu and how it relates within the Tannisho. Um, somebody else is joining. Hang on a second. Oh, two people are joining. Just let Naomi join in. Okay. Okay. So again, once again, good evening, everyone. And as I just mentioned, that we've been talking about the five tenets of Jodo Shinshu and how it is in relation with the um, Tanisho. And of course, the first one was about the primal vow, how Jodo Shinshu is based on the primal vow of Amida Buddha. And then the second one was about the Shinjin, entrusting heart, is how is the cause for our birth in the Pure Land. And then we talked about how in this life, one of the benefits or the benefits in this life is to be in the ranks of the truly assured or the non retrogressive state, which means that at the end of this life, and the fourth one, which is the fact that at the end of this life, we will, through the working of Amida Buddha, attain enlightenment. So the moment we enter the Pure Land, we become one with Amida Buddha, and we attain enlightenment. So the Pure Land itself can be although it's described in a very minute detail, one does not necessarily have to think of it as a physical place that one goes to, but more a state of being, if you will, a state of existence. And so uh, today, going to talk about the fifth of these five tenets. And this is probably the one that's one of the more controversial ones, or can be seen as controversial. And it is the true purport of Amida's great compassion is for this foolish being full of blind passions, or the evil one. In Japanese, we call this akunin shoki. Akunin is an evil being, or yeah, I guess that word evil has so many it carries a lot of baggage, but it it does not mean so. If you go strictly by the Christian definition of evil, evil is considered that which one does against the will of God. And so, when we talk about evil here, we're not talking about that kind of evil. Basically, more good and bad actions. It also talks about our in intrinsic being, and that we all have the potentiality for doing uh, not so good things, if you will. Anyways, um, within the Tannisho, one of the most, if not the most famous chapter is the chapter three, and in chapter three, if we examine chapter three, it basically well, this is chapter three. Even a, even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land. So it goes without saying that an evil person will. Though it is so, people commonly say, even an evil person attains birth, so it goes without saying that a good person will. This statement may seem well founded at first, but it runs counter to the intent of the primal vow, which is other power. This is because people who rely on doing good through their self power fail to entrust themselves wholeheartedly to other power, and therefore not in accord with Amida's primal vow. But when they overturn the minor self power and entrust themselves to other power, they will attain birth in the true and fulfilled pure land or fulfilled land. It is impossible for us who are possessed of blind passions to free ourselves from birth and death through any practice whatever. Sorrowing at this, Amida made the vow, the essential intent of which is the evil person's attainment of Buddhahood. Hence, evil persons who entrust themselves to other power are precisely the ones who possess the true cause of birth. Accordingly, he said, even the good person is born in the Pure Land. So, without question, is the person who is evil. So, this is Yui Embo, the disciple of Shinan Shoni, who's recollecting about discussions he had with Shinan Shoni, and in particular, this one about the evil person being the primary target of Amida's primal vow. And this becomes very famous, perhaps the most famous quote within the Tannisho, and is well known throughout Japan. And partially it's because of the sort of controversial nature of how it's explained. Um, he talks about good and evil here, and which is, when we start talking about good and evil, it is uh, an issue that's common to all religions. Most, yeah, I don't know of any religion that does not talk about good and evil, good or bad, and it might even be the basis for our whole culture itself. Um, we whether it's in books, whether it's in uh, movies, whatever, this is a old theme talking of good and evil. Star Wars is a very good black and white example of good and evil, you know, and they portray it very much so with the Darth Vader wearing all the black, and that's evil type thing. Um, in fact, just as an aside, there are those who claim that Star Wars is very Buddhistic in that we talk about the Force and letting go to the Force, and of course they have the Queen Amidala, and so there are people who claim that there is some Buddhist elements to it. Anyways, that's here nor there. Um, but as I said, this passage seems to be contradictory. If we look at how we normally perceive things, obviously, a person that has 50% in school is a passing grade. But if 50% is passing, then 80% is much more passing in our rational, regular way of thinking. But Shinan says the exact opposite here, right? He says, even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land. So it goes without saying that an evil person will. So, first of all, we need to figure out, well, how does Shinan explain this? Like, why does he say this here when we see uh, in all the writings of Shinran? Shinran tells us right in the true teaching, practice, and realization of the Pure Land Way, or the Kyogyo Shinsho. He says right in the first chapter that the true teaching is the teaching of the larger sutra on Amida, and the reason being primarily because of the 18th vow. And we call that the primal vow, or the Hongan in Japanese. So Honganji is the primal vow temple. But when you look at that primal vow, right at the very end of it, it clearly states, excluded and from being saved is what I put, are those who commit the 5 grave offenses and those who slander the right Dharma. The 5 grave offenses are also known as the 5 grave evils. and they are killing one's father, killing one's mother, killing an arahat, spilling the blood of the Buddha, or creating disharmony within the Sangha. Okay, these are considered five grave offenses or evils, and it says right in the 18th vow, excluded are those who commit these offenses. Okay? And yet, Shinan says that, primarily it's the evil being that is the focus of the working of Amida Buddha. So we need to find out, first of all, how Buddhism itself understands this good and evil idea. And there is a early Buddhist text called the Udanavarga Sutra. And there's a song within there um, known as the Hymns of the Seven Buddhas. And these seven Buddhas apparently it includes Shakyamuni Buddha, but apparently there were seven, according to the sutra, there were seven Buddhas who came into this world in the past, and all the Buddhas state the same thing: do not create evil deeds. Sho aku makusa. Only do good deeds. Shuzen bugyo, to purify the heart and mind within. Jijo goi. This is a teaching of the Buddhas. Ze shobutsu kyo. So, in other words, what it's saying is to refrain from doing evil and to do good in order to purify the inner being or inner self, which will lead to the attainment of enlightenment. So here, clearly it states to refrain from doing evil and do good, right? That's a very basic understanding or assumption of Buddhism. It was said, though, that this teaching is so simple that even a 4-year-old could understand, yet so complicated that it takes a lifetime to try to practice. Okay, so we try to be good, but we all know that there's certain things that throw us off our path, if you will, right? Um, Within this past year, I have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes from my doctors. And so it means I'm supposed to cut out sweets. And yet, when there's a box of chocolates in front of me, there's always one that you have to have, right? So you know that it's not supposed to be good for you, but the temptation is too great. And that happens to us in all sorts of uh, places in life. So, but basic understanding in Buddhism is that what is good in Buddhism is those actions which lead to peace and tranquility for the self and all others. Okay, so it's not, when we talk about good and bad or evil in Buddhism, it's not necessarily just for the self, but it's also keeping in mind for all beings. Okay, so we want to create peace and harmony for the self, but also for all beings. And this becomes a very difficult thing to do because often what we think is good for myself may not necessarily be good for others as well. Okay, we might inconvenience others because of what we think is good for me, right? And in contrast, what is bad or evil are acts which lead to disharmony and suffering for the self and all others. Okay? So, even though we might not be conscious of the actions that we do are affecting others, um, everything we do in one way or another has a ripple effect that will affect all other beings, just as we are affected by all other actions from others as well. So, another way, another way of understanding this is to say, um, doing good deeds will purify the self and lead to enlightenment. Conversely, doing bad or evil acts will cause one to remain in delusion, and in the worst case, fall into the Buddhist hell. Okay? Doing good deeds lead to good results, and doing bad deeds lead to suffering. Okay? So this is a very simplistic understanding, and it's very common, I think, in morality. Um, uh, you know, if we think about the society, this all fits in very well and makes sense. However, uh, if we go by this, this can lead to um, an elitist movement or attitude. And what I mean by this is that in order to do good in Buddhism, it means to follow the teachings of the Buddha and abide by those teachings. Well, in Japan, particularly around what we call the Heian period, this is a period just before Shinran Shonin was born. It was very much a class-oriented society, where in that time the aristocrats or the nobilities uh, had the major power, or they ruled basically Japan. And it was the warrior class, which is a class below them, that then usurps that power for a period of time after this Heian period. Um, and so during this Heian period, as I said, in order to follow or to become or to do good, to follow the teachings of the Buddha, one had to enter a monastery and become either a monk or a nun. But there was a problem with this in that because Buddhism in Japan came from a top-down introduction, it was brought in by the imperial court, and so it was largely uh, focused on the well-educated. Okay, so when it entered Japan, it came in through China and Korea, but it was all in Chinese characters. So one would have to be able to read Chinese characters in order to be able to study it, which makes sense. But to be educated enough to read Chinese characters meant that you needed to be a certain class of individual. Okay, peasants and farmers, many of them were most of them were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. So of course, for them, there's no way that they can enter a monastery and become a monk. The way that the society was in Japan. So this led to this became quite disparaging when the monks and those in the temples associated only with the aristocrats, and so uh, they led a very high style of living along with the aristocrats and the nobility. But there were certain monks within that who felt that this was very much against the teachings of the Buddha. And so they tried to reform or change it. And one of the individuals who did that, or the person who was very much responsible for doing that, was this person by the name of Honen Shoni, who was Shinran's teacher. And in fact, this, what he said was that there had to be a teaching that wasn't based on discrimination or um, merit based teaching. There had to be something that transcended that. And so this is when he encountered the teaching of Amida Buddha. And he said that, the teachings of Amida Buddha did not discriminate between the wise and foolish, young and old, good and evil, men and women. All that was necessary was to have, quote, faith or shinjin, and or faith or entrusting heart in the infinite light and boundless compassion of Amida Buddha. Okay? Um, and his reasoning was that since we are ignorant beings filled with blind passions, the amount of good that we can do is truly limited, and definitely not enough to warrant enlightenment through our own efforts. Okay? Because we do have this self-centered ego. It, the what we consider to be a good deed is often tainted by some self-serving need, whether it be to get acknowledged, whether it's to receive those acknowledgments, or thanks, or whatever it might be, right? Um, that becomes then self-serving, and so any good, quote unquote, good that we can do really is not enough to attain enlightenment. At the same time, Honen realized too that the working of Amida Buddha is so great that there is no evil that we can do that would prevent us from being embraced by these teachings. And in his most famous work, the collection of passages on the Nembutsu chosen by Amida Buddha in the Primal Vow, Honen states, "Know that doubt is a cause for one to remain in the house of birth and death. Faith is a true cause for one to enter the palace of enlightenment." So he sort of shifted this around. So he no longer says um, that your practice is what makes or brings you to enlightenment. It's not merit based, but it's whether you can fully entrust yourself to Amida Buddha. So it becomes a faith based teaching. And this was revolutionary in the um, history of Buddhism. Okay, the understanding that there is a greater power, something that transcends us, that we need to let go to, and when we do so, that's when we find true peace, and that's the path to enlightenment, according to Honet. Okay. And then he also stressed that the idea that the primary concern of great compassion of Amida Buddha is for those that need it the most, and that mainly for those who are completely incapable of attaining enlightenment through their own efforts. So this meant he was talking about the average layperson, whether it be the farmer, whether it be, uh, some foolish being, or even an evil being. Those were the targets of the great compassion. So the example that's sometimes given is a family that has number of children, and the mother, of course, loves each children equally, but if there's one child that is ill, the attention or the focus of the mother goes to that child more so than the other children. And similarly, so the primary concern of Amida is focused on those who need it the most, those who need the help the most, and that is the ignorant. He doesn't say that those who are educated and smart cannot enter the Pure Land, but he says the primary focus is for those who are completely incapable. And Shinan Shoni, and so this idea that Honen has is passed down to his disciples, and he was very careful of who he shared this with. So it wasn't shared openly to everyone. I think Honen himself was a little worried that people would misunderstand it. Um, and in fact, it had been misinterpreted when it says that the evil person is the primary concern. There were people who use this as a way to rationalize their actions. And this is one of the things that Yu Yenbo is lamenting over, that there were people there that were living wantonly, saying that, while the primal vow is for the evil person, so I should do evil acts, if you will, right? And so um, Yu Yenbo, who also received this teaching from Shinan, wrote it down in the Tannisho. And um, Shinan Shoni does allude to this in other parts of his teachings, but he doesn't come out clearly as he does in this chapter 3 of the Tanisho. This is the most clear example. Like he couldn't be clearer on what he means by this, right? Even a good person attains birth in a pure land, so it goes without saying that an evil person will, right? So he's come out. There's no uh, misunderstanding. He comes out definitely and states something very strong statement that he makes, and so but he also alludes to this in other parts of his own writings, and in particular, right at the beginning of the true teaching, practice, and realization of Pure Land Way, he emphasizes this in the preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho. And he says, I reflect within myself. The universal vow, difficult to fathom, is indeed a great vessel bearing us across the ocean difficult to cross. The unhindered light is the sun of wisdom, dispersing the darkness of our ignorance. Thus it is that when conditions for the teaching of birth in the Pure Land had matured, Devadatta provoked Ajatasattu to commit grave crimes. And when the opportunity arose for explaining the pure act by which birth is settled, Shakyamuni led Vaidehi to select the land of peace. In their selfless love, these incarnated ones, Devadatta, Ajatasattu, Vaidehi, all aspired to save the multitude of beings from pain and affliction. And in his compassion, Shakyamuni, the great hero, sought indeed to bless those committing the 5 grave offenses, those slandering the Dharma, and those lacking the seed of Buddhahood. So he comes out very clearly here to say that Shakyamuni is trying to uh, save those who would commit these 5 grave offenses, or slander the Dharma, or lack completely the seeds to enlightenment. Of course, this 3 individuals he mentions here, and I mentioned it before, talking about the tragedy at Raja Grihar. This whole story about King Bimbisara and Queen Vaidehi wanting the heir to the throne, not being able to have a son for many years. And in the end, it's a mountain ascetic who tells the King Bimbisara not to worry, that when he dies, he will be reborn as his son. And I've told this story many times, so I just skipped it. But these are the three. There are 3 primary characters in there. However, after telling the story of Queen Vaidehi and how she wishes to um, be born in Amita's Pure Land, and then she's told, the various ways to contemplate on the Pure Land and visualize Amida Buddha. And then also she's told of the 9 grades of individuals who exist, and realizing that she is the lowest of the low grade. She tried to kill her own son um, just after he was born, but she failed. And so she would be considered the lowest of the low. Remember, the 5 grave offenses is to kill one's mother and to kill one's father, but I'm sure it's just as grave of offense to kill one's child. And so she would be considered one of those who would be the lowest of the low. And yet, there's a path of salvation for her, and that is the Nembutsu teaching. But what's interesting is after Shinran recants the story of the tragedy at Rajagrihar, uh, he actually so this part is also in the what we call the meditation sutra, or the contemplation sutra, right? But what Shinan does in his chapter on Shinjin in the Kyogyo Shinsho, he then goes on to quote from the Nirvana Sutra. And the Nirvana Sutra is, interestingly enough, it carries on this story after the fact, right? So it talks about what happens to Ajatasattu after his father passes away, after his father has been starved to death in the jail. Um, Over time, Ajatasattu, the king, has guilt over what he had done. And so, um, with this guilt, his body starts to react, and he starts to have these wounds, open wounds that form, and he's festered and filled with pus that comes out, and he's just completely a mess physically. And so he starts consulting his advisors as to why this is so. And one by one, they all try to explain away what's going on. They'll some of them use excuses like, well, it was your father's fault to begin with because he killed that mountain ascetic who became you. So he was the one that first took your life, and therefore, in retribution, it's fair game for you to have taken his life. So they try to rationalize all of this. However, uh, having heard all these various rationalizations, Ajatasattu is not calmed at all. He still is very bothered by what has happened. And in the end, he has an audience with the Buddha. And what's interesting there is when the Buddha meets with Ajatasattu, the Buddha realizes the great suffering that Ajatasattu is going through. And the Buddha is quoted as saying that until the time when Ajatasattu, his illness or pain is calmed, the Buddha shall not enter perfect nirvana, okay, parinirvana. So he's saying, I will not get fully enlightened until you are or we're able to help you in your suffering. Okay. So this is showing the real concern of the Buddha. It is the concern for what we would consider a despot, the very bad individual, and yet the Buddha has great concern for that individual. And in fact, the Buddha realizes or that he is the one that needs the most help at this moment, right? So this is showing how the care of the Buddha goes to the one that needs the most attention at that particular time. Um, So again, that's what Shinan Shonin says here in this preface of the Kyogyo Shinsho. Shakyamuni, the great hero, sought indeed to bless those committing the five great offenses, those slandering Dharma, and those lacking the seed of Buddhahood. We know, therefore, that the auspicious name embodying the perfectly supreme virtues is true wisdom that transforms our evil into virtue, and that the diamond like Shinjin, so difficult to accept, is true reality that sweeps away doubt and brings us to attainment of enlightenment. Okay? So, again, what Shinan is stating here is that Shakyamuni, trying to save these individuals, um, emphasize the fact that this, what we call Shinjin or entrusting mind, is the way to be liberated or to be freed. And this is why he called it the diamond like Shinjin. And when we look at, as I mentioned, Vaidehi or Devadatta, Ajatasattu, they are in fact individuals who have committed these five grave offenses. And yet, specifically, um, it, they are the ones that are the focus of the Buddha's compassion. And perhaps the most, uh, the best example in the Tannisho that shows about the evil being the focus is in the postscript of the Tannisho. And Yuyenbo writes, the master would often say, when I consider deeply the vow of Amida, which arose from five kappas of profound thought, I realized that it was entirely for the sake of myself alone. Then how am I filled with gratitude for the primal vow, in which Amida resolved to save me, though I am burdened with such heavy karma? So this is where Shinran really becomes personal. And he says, you know, this teaching, he identifies himself with Ajatasattu, with uh, Devadatta, with Vaidehi. For Shinran, he saw himself as the evil one, the one burdened with this heavy karma. Okay, and so he realized that the working of Amida Buddha was for him, Shinran alone. And so for each of us, we also have to find our own path. And when we awaken to it, we realize it is for me alone. It's no good if somebody else is reciting the Nembutsu somewhere else. It only becomes true and real when it becomes for me that this is my path. Um, Honen Shorin was very much like this as well. And there's actually a famous story about this thief and his encounter with Honen Shonin. This thief was uh, his nickname was Mimijiro. Mimi is ear. Jiro is his name, but he was often known as Mimijiro. And the reason why was he had sort of a disfigured ear, so his earlobes were huge, and so he had this nickname of Mimijiro, and he was a common thief who lived in Osaka. And one day, this Mimijiro decides to rob the temple that Honen Shonin was staying at. And it just so happened that that day that evening, there was a Dharma gathering that was supposed to happen at that evening. So early in the morning, this Mimijiro goes to the temple and he hides out. And if you've been to Japan and seen like temples or traditional structure, there's always, or 99% of the time, there is a wooden sort of hallway that's outside, like that sort of is around the perimeter of like the hall. So if you go to, like, if you think of Honganji, for instance, there before you go into the main hall, there's like there's stairs that lead up, and then there's a sort of this wooden, um, I don't want to call it veranda, but there's a, yeah, an open area before you go in. Okay. So this Mimijiro, what he did was he went early in the morning and he hid underneath that walkway. Okay. So he was not seen by the others. And he basically hid there all day, not knowing that there was a gathering in the evening. His plan was that in the evening, when things quieted down, he would come out and then he would go about his robbery. But there was a gathering that evening, and Honen Shonin was given a Dharma talk. And it was there that Honen started talking about the Nembutsu teaching and how the Nembutsu teaching does not discriminate between the rich and the poor, the wise and the foolish, between the good and evil, or between male and female, that in all our lives, Honen said, there are going to be potentialities for all many different kinds of things, but the only thing that was important, according to Honen Shoni, was to hear the name of the Buddha, to recite the name of the Buddha, and then trust into the working of Amida Buddha. So this Mimijiro, as he's listening to this, he starts really listening to the teaching, and he realizes Honen Shonin is speaking to him. Now, of course, Honen didn't know Mimijiro was there, and he was giving this Dharma talk, but Mimijiro felt that Honen was speaking directly to him. And he was so moved by it that he starts doubting or having second thoughts about the robbery that he's about to attempt. So in the meantime, he ends up falling asleep under there, and when he wakes up, it's morning. So he crawls out of the crawl space that he's in, and he's caught by some of the monks at this temple. And so he fesses up to his, the past wrongdoings he's done, and that he was so moved by the teachings that Honen taught, that he has he feels very bad about what he's done in the past, and that he will try to turn over a new leaf. And Honen rejoices at the wondrous encounters, or the cause and effect, causes and conditions that had brought this Mimijiro to the temple, to have him hide underneath the walkway, and Honen said this is the working of the Buddha. So you would think after having all that things would end up nicely. However, Mimijiro was not. I mean, old habits die hard, and so even though he was feeling really uh, uplifted when he left the temple, his comrades, or the other thieves in his group or gathering, would not let him go so easily. And so Mimijiro ends up continuing his thieving ways, and he would have deep regret and remorse about it, but just because he had no other uh, occupation, or was good at anything other than thieving, he continued this. But in the meantime, he also continued listen to the teachings whenever he could. So in the meantime, he goes on a gambling. He goes gambling one night, and he ends up um, winning money from this individual who who was not too happy of losing money to him. So this individual sets out a plot to assassinate Mimijiro, and he coerces one of Mimijiro's friends, well, friends, to do the dastardly deed. So they end up one night getting Mimijiro very drunk. They go on a binge and they get him really drunk, and Mimijiro passes out, and they he's taken to his room, and he passes out on his futon. And in the middle of the night, this so-called friend goes in and is about to kill him. And so he draws his sword, and he slowly or lifts up the covers of the futon mattress. And when he does so, he's surprised to see Mimijiro. Uh, at first, he thought he was snoring, but what he was doing was, as he was exhaling, the nembutsu was coming out of his mouth, and he looked very calm in his sleep. And so this so-called friend is startled by this, and instead of killing Mimijiro, he realizes his own faults, and he wakes Mimijiro up and says, I was about to stab you, to kill you, but I saw you, and you were chanting the Nembutsu in your sleep, and it moved me so much that I want to become this follower of this teaching. And Mimijiro realized at that moment too. He realized how, even though he had been listening to the teachings, he had gone on with his um, thievery, and he um, remorsefully, or he thanks his friend actually for awakening him as well. And they both end up going the following day to Honen's place, and they both receive the Dharma name, and they become followers of Honen Shoni. But um, again, uh, Dave or Mimijiro and his friend, they both encounter the true karmic heavy karma that they had with them, and realize that the working of the Buddha is to awaken such a being. For Shinan Shoni, he felt he was such a being. Um, Reflecting once more on the expression of Shinan's innermost thoughts, I find that it does not differ in the least from the precious words of Chantal. So this quote here is from Zendo Daishi or Chantal. Know yourselves to be a foolish being of karmic evil, caught in birth and death, ever sinking and ever wandering in transmigration from innumerable kalpas in the past, with never a condition that would lead to emancipation. So this passage, Chantal is saying that until we encounter this Nembutsu teachings, we have been transmigrating or going uh, in circles, if you will, in this existence of samsara. And it's only when we encounter the Dharma through the Nembutsu that we can awaken from our delusion. Thus, how grateful I feel for Shinan's words, in which he gives himself as an example in order to make us realize we are in delusion, knowing nothing at all of the depth of our karmic evil or the vastness of Amida's benevolence. Earlier, I mentioned that, Hon and Shoni thought the reason why um, we can't attain enlightenment through our own efforts was because uh, we are beings filled with blind passions, and therefore any good that we do pales, or there's no good that we can do that can cause our enlightenment on our own merit, right? And at the same time, the vastness of Amida's working is so great that there's no evil that will cause it for us not to receive it. So that was what Shinran followed as well. In truth, myself and others discuss only good and evil, leaving Amida's benevolence out of consideration. Among Master Shinran's words were, I know nothing at all of good or evil, for if I could know thoroughly, as Amida Tathagata knows, that an act was good, then I would know good. If I could know thoroughly, as a Tathagata knows, that an act was evil, then I would know evil. But with a foolish being full of blind passions, in this fleeting world, this burning house, all matters, without exception, are empty and false, totally without truth and sincerity. The Nembutsu alone is true and real. So for Shinran, ultimately, it came down to the fact that all the things that happen in this world, or things that he valued or considered important, these are all fleeting and impermanent, and not something that we should rely upon. Whereas uh, the only thing that was true and real for Shinran, he said, was the Nembutsu, was the working of Amida Buddha, which is constantly waking, trying to awaken us. And in fact, if we only, if we could do good or knew good, what as truly good as Amida does, then we would know good. But the level, the extent of what we think is good is limited, and therefore it pales in comparison to the working of Amida Buddha. So, the very simple example would be I sit here and I give these talks, and I give Dharma talks, and I say what's good and what's bad, and et cetera, et cetera. And yet at the same time I feel no remorse. Well, I might feel a tinge of remorse, but when a mosquito is biting me on my arm, I'll slap at it um, to kill the mosquito. I'm taking its life without thinking twice about it. I might think a little bit about it, but not really. And so here I am. On one hand, I'm trying to say this is good or this is bad, and yet I'm doing this act of killing, taking life. And so that's my true self, or that's who I am. And for such a being as that, the only way to truly uh, find peace or uh, enlightenment is really through the working of Amida Buddha or the Nembutsu. And therefore, for Shinran, who, so the good and evil that we're looking at here is not necessarily like a good and evil that we would think in a daily life thing, but it's much more fundamental than that. It's the realization that I am living in the world of delusion. I am in this world of delusion, and therefore, there's nothing I can do uh, through my own power to get me beyond that delusion. But we can encounter that when we realize that there's something that's been working towards us, working towards awakening us all this time, and that is the working of Amida Buddha, the infinite light, boundless compassion that is constantly working upon us. So that is, in a nutshell, this idea of the uh, the evil being as the one entering the Pure Land. So, uh, questions or comments? This one's probably one of the harder ones to wrap your mind around.
Sensei,
Yes.
this last, it almost seems like, why would I want to be a good person? if I can just be evil and then sort of let it all go and recite the Nembutsu, then I'm okay. I'm all good. What is there in this that encourages people to be good and live in harmony with others?
So for 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 one thing, the person who thinks that they're not truly reflecting. In other words, they're using it as a scapegoat. Shinan did mention in one of his writings is that just because there's an antidote doesn't mean you should take poison.
Hmm.
So the person when we talk about evil, it's not the person who is uh, the evil person is the one who truly reflects on their lives and sees the delusion within it. So it's not it when a person says, oh, I could do evil just by reciting the Nembutsu, they're actually using the Nembutsu as a scapegoat for their actions. So this is not what Shinan is talking about when he talks about the evil person. The
Okay.
evil person is the one who, for Shinan, it was upon his real deep self reflection, realizing for him his own uh, egocentric self. So it's not. I think we have to be very careful here when we read this. It's not to point to others and saying this is evil or this is good, but it's really to reflect within oneself. Okay, so what when we truly um, make the effort to reflect within ourselves, we begin to see um, the shadows within ourselves. And I think I mentioned before, the brighter the light, the sharper the shadows become. So the more we encounter the Dharma or the working of Amida Buddha, the more we begin to see our limited self, perhaps. And so maybe evil is not a good word. Our ignorant self, maybe we begin to see our limitations of who we are, and it's it's inherent, I think, in um, all of us that we have this, yeah, egocentric self. When we think about our animal instincts. The whole idea of survival of the fittest. We want to have what's best for myself when it ultimately comes down to it, and so um, that can create a lot of suffering as well if we're unaware of that. By becoming aware of it, um, I think it allows one to be empathetic. It allows one to care about what is going on, not only for myself, but the world around us. Um, and I think that's where the true reflection comes in. So this is never
Hmm.
meant to be sort of a blanket statement to say, okay, oh, this gives you the green light to do evil. I think that's a very superfluous understanding of it, and the more this Shinran was talking about self reflection and seeing within myself, uh, identifying myself as the being that is filled with blind passion, and that's what Shinran did in his life. Was that whether he was spending 20 years as a monk on Mount Hiei, uh, and even after coming down, he continued to reflect and continued um, to see, I guess, the true self. And I think this is not necessarily just unique to Jodo Shinshu or even Buddhism. And this is why you'll see some of the greatest individuals being truly humble, is because they don't see themselves as being this this grand individuals, but they see the true self. Um, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Atsumi-san. Oh, you're muted. You have to unmute. Okay. Okay.
Impression is that if we try to be good, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
ordinary way, that means we are not trusting the Amida's primary goal. So we are not
So
believing in. So
okay.
away
So
from the belief.
so there I think there's also an understanding of good and evil, or good and bad, in a societal sense, is different from the um, attainment of enlightenment. You know, there are certain things that we need to do in society to live together in harmony, and that's one level of right and wrong, if you will. Okay, but I think there is a much deeper level of right or good and bad, which is more the how can I say, the awakened way of understanding things versus an delusional way of understanding. So there are things that we do to in our daily life, in order to get through, or to have harmony within society. And I think that's a one level, but there is a much deeper level, fundamental level, when we're talking about our own existence, our own mortality, and then we begin to reflect on, how am I living my life, truly living my life. So I think, and it does ultimately then, it should have some reflection on your daily life as well, right? It, it doesn't mean you stop trying to be good or you try being bad, but I think naturally, when we realize or we see our inner selves, yet we try to, um, okay, our actions become a way of um, trying to better that inner self, if you will. But that's almost like a byproduct of seeing the inner self. So when we see so again with Jodo Shinshu, they talk about the two deep minds. On one hand, you see the limitation of the self, and at the same time, you're awakened to the immenseness or the great working of the Dharma. And so then there's this inner joy or appreciation that comes about from it. And when we get there, then there we as a byproduct, if you will, of that awakening, you start living your life in a way that is not harmful to others, that is more caring of all beings. And so it's not that that is the goal, but it is an outcome from awakening to the both the mind that says, I'm truly a being filled with blind passion, at the same instant realizing, wait, even for me, there is this great working that is allowing me or all beings to equally receive the Dharma. So, as I mentioned, that Honen Shonin was the one who uh, saw that in the way that Buddhism was being practiced when he first started in the monastery was this the elitist way of thinking where you have to become a monk, you train very hard, and you become recognized for your the merits that you've accumulated through all your hard work, etc. um, and yet it felt very empty because it was only basically it was adding fire to the ego is what it was fanning the flames of the ego, in that the more you go up as a higher ranked monk, or you get the status, and you're hobnobbing with the nobility, etc. And for Honen, he realized that that was missing the mark, and then he realized that there had to be a teaching that transcended all that, and that was this teaching of Amida Buddha, that there is a working that goes beyond any of our discriminations, and just being able to awaken to that um, is where we find the ultimate liberation. So um, yeah, basically, um, I think we do definitely need to try to be good, and for many reasons. For one, to keep harmony within the society, but also, as I mentioned, this wanting to do good or wanting to help others, thinking about others, comes about as a byproduct of how we are nurtured, basically through the teachings. When we begin to realize that we are interconnected, that we are one together, then it only makes sense that we should care for others as well. Um, yeah, and that's why in Japanese, there's a saying that the children um, are raised by looking at the backs of their parents. Yeah. And that saying is that your actions as a human being are perceived by your children, and they will in turn um, hopefully be raised to react in certain ways. And so our actions do affect how we are, who we are, and often that action is guided by our understanding or how we receive these teachings. So then it becomes like a byproduct of the teachings. Any other comments or questions? Karen, you look very pensive and uh, in deep thought.
This Dharma sense requires, I think, quite a bit of reflection. You have to really think, and it's almost on some level like a lesson in logic. If this, then that. If that, then this. And it kind of tries to reason also, which is interesting because it's not just feeding you something, it's wanting you to comprehend the underpinnings of that. I still really like that gate you told us about, that like the saloon gate. Well, that one, or gate where you go through, but at the same time something else is coming towards you. I think that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, that you reminded me. One of my teachers, this is when I was still, I'd forgotten all about it, but when I was still a student, He was a teacher that told me, read the Tannisho in your 20s, read the Tannisho in your 30s, read the Tannisho in your 40s, read the Tannisho in your 50s. And what he was trying to tell me was that, well, I think what he was trying to tell me is that depending on your age, your understanding will be different as well. So depending on our experiences in life, and even it could be just the time of our life where we're thinking about certain things, we can read it completely differently. And in fact, I think it's very true. Um, I think at this age, I probably do understand it completely different from when I first studied in my 20s. But again, um, when I was in my 20s, I don't think I really e- ever thought about uh, mortality or people passing away, or those things were not really high on my um, scale of things to think about or worry about in my daily life. But I think things change as you get older. Uh, Speaking of change, Debbie, I had a wonderful talk with Josie today.
She told me about it. She was super pleased. Thank you for doing that. My daughter's in university for she's studying psychology and religion, and Sensei was good enough to be interviewed for a paper she's writing. Anyway, yeah, Sensei, she said you checked all the boxes, which I think as a 25-year-old, that's super high praise. So she said you're really helpful. She's got a lot of transcribing to do. You answered, yeah, you gave her a ton of material for the paper. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, you're welcome. But I mean, I don't think I would have had that conversation with her when we went to Japan together when she was 16, 17, somewhere around there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah,
So
and
it was,
she wouldn't have, what you say about age is true. Like you don't have the context until you get some years behind you. So,
yeah.
we can't receive those messages. Even though you want to, I think you can't until you have some experiences.
Well, we had our Dharma school this past weekend, and because it was daylight savings, I was trying to tell the kids about how time itself is relative. And I mentioned to them, if you have a 1-year-old child and a 50-year-old person, right? The simple math says that person is 50 times older than that child, right? But if that child becomes 2 years old and that person is 51 years old, okay, now it's gotten closer to 25 times the life. And so as the child grows older, exponentially speaking, they're catching up to us. Right? But at the same time, I also told them that by living 50 years, um, compared to the 1-year-old, we have so much more junk in our minds that it's easy for us to forget things because it's filled with stuff. Whereas the 1-year-old or the child takes it in like a sponge because they still have all that space that they could fill up. Right. Yeah. Anyways, are there any other questions or comments? Or if not, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for these lectures, and I will let you know when I starting up the next set. I still have to figure out what I'm going to I guess learn together with all of you. But thank you for um, joining us through these 5 sessions.
Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you
very
very much. Good night.
It's
Thank you very
excellent.
much.
Thank you,
Sensei.
Good
Sensei.
night.
Thank you.
We should
Thank
close
you.
with an
Thank you.
embassy. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Have a good summer.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.